Welcome everyone to this academic dialogue space. My name is Lisette and today I'm joined by Yuri and Isabel. In this episode, we will explore an important question for us as master's students. In particular, we want to understand how coloniality and communication continue to influence language education policies, as researchers such as Miranda et al. And Garcia suggest this is a topic that requires careful reflection. So, let's start with this episode.
Thank you, Lisette. I am very glad to be part of this conversation. Indeed, this topic is not only theoretical. On the contrary, it directly affects teachers, students, and communities in their everyday experiences.
Exactly. Our intention today in this conversation is not to give final answers. We are going to open a space for reflection, and I would like to ask these important questions. What does a language policy really mean in a multicultural country like Colombia?
To begin with, Yuri, please, let's give us insights and please explain us. Could you wrote the perspective of what we mean by coloniality in language education?
Of course, first of all, it is important to understand that coloniality didn't disappear after independence. In fact, it is still present in many systems today. For instance, in education, English is often seen as the most important language. As a result, indigenous language and even local forms of Spanish are sometimes undervalued. In this sense, Garcia 2017 explains that bilingual policies can reproduce inequalities if we don't question their foundation.
In addition to this situation in Colombia reflects this problem. According to Miranda 2024, many universities in Colombia required English for graduations. All the students have to graduate with English. However, at the same time, there are very few real actions to support native languages. Therefore, in this kind of event, we can observe a gap between what policies really wants to say and what actually happens in our context here in Colombia in our real classrooms.
So, in other words, could we say that policies promote inclusion in theory, but exclusion in practice? So please, explain us.
Yes, exactly. For this reason, Lopez Urbina and Bonilla Mora 2026 propose what they call counter-hegemonic language teaching. That is to say, we need to resist dominant ideas and instead adopt approaches like translanguaging. In doing so, we can value all the language that students use in their daily lives.
Now, Isabel, let us look at other contexts. How does Colombia compare with other countries? Can you please give us some examples?
This is a very interesting question. For example, in the Basque country, the language Euresca almost disappeared in the past. However, thanks to strong policies and community efforts, it had been revitalized. As a result, today, this language is an official language and it is used in education. This shows that change is possible when there is a commitment between communities, policies, and state. Yes, of course, but if access remains unequal, it might actually widen the digital divide.
Okay, on the other hand, Colombia has an even more complex situation. There are more than 65 indigenous languages, as well as Palenquero, Creole, and Romani, and according to graph cited by Miranda et al., multilingualism should not be seen as a problem. Instead, it is a reflection of social and historical diversity. Given this, how can one single policy represent all this richness?
In reality, it cannot be possible. That is the problem. Therefore, instead of general policies, we need situated policies. That means that policies have to be created with communities not imposed on them.
Okay, let's continue with more reflection and proposals. At this point, it is important to ask, what can we do as educators?
First, we need to reflect on our own role. Sometimes, without noticing it, we reproduce these inequalities. For this reason, adopting a translanguaging perspective is key. In other words, we should value all the language our students bring, not only the standard ones.
I would like to add that all the universities here in Colombia and another country have to rethink their policies. Bilingualism shouldn't simply mean learning English. They have to include or offer spaces for indigenous languages, promote research in Spanish, and of course, recognize local knowledge.
Furthermore, this discussion is also related to knowledge production. As Miranda et al. Mentioned, there is a common idea. If you don't publish in English, you don't exist. This reflects what Hemmel describes as a form of control. In other words, language decides what knowledge is considered valid and important, of course. Therefore, if people use multiple languages in communication, knowledge should also reflect that diversity.
Okay, finally, this is why local research is so important. For example, Lopez Urbina and Bonilla Mora 2026 publish in Spanish and focus on Colombian realities. In this way, they challenge dominant perspectives.
To conclude, this episode leaves us with important reflections. Rather than giving final answers, we hope to encourage further thinking. Coloniality in language policies is still present today. Therefore, change requires continuous effort and critical awareness. As Miranda et al. Suggests, transformation involves addressing deeper inequalities. Likewise, Walsh reminds us that change happens in a space of resistance.
Thank you very much for listening us. So, see you next episode.
We invite you to continue reflecting on these ideas. Until next time.